This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm speaking to April Windle. April is a naturalist with a particular interest in lichens, especially those occupying our rainforest habitat along the western seaboard of the British Isles. April works on a variety of lichen education and conservation projects and co-chairs the Education and Promotions Committee of the British Lichen Society. April talks to me about what lichen actually is, where you can find it, and why it's interesting and worth studying. I start off with the fundamentally important question: what is a lichen?
Very good question. So there does tend to be a little bit of confusion as to where lichens sit in the wider web of life. And most people look at lichens and actually think they're a plant. But they're very, very wrong in thinking that. Despite their plant-like appearance, lichens are actually a fungus. So they sit within the biological kingdom fungi. And what they do is they partner up and they interact with a photosynthetic organism, which is normally an algae or a cyanobacteria. And when you have all of these different organisms together, that's when you have a lichen form. So they do look like plants, but they are absolutely not plants. They are fungi, and I think that's quite important to keep in mind. And with recent genetic studies, what it's actually showing is that fungi are more closely related to humans than they are to plants. So I just think it's really fascinating. Lichens are what we call a symbiosis, and they really are the textbook example of a symbiotic organism where you have multiple different life forms coexisting and having a dependency on one another. So in general, as a sweeping statement, there's always exceptions to the rules. Lichens are mainly a fungus. It's normally about 80% of the lichen association is a fungus. And then the rest of it is what is comprised of the photosynthetic part, so either the algae or the photosynthetic bacteria, which we call a cyanobacteria. And again, they all come together, and that's when you get a lichen form.
So the bit that you are seeing mainly, is that the amalgamation of all those organisms, or would that be the fungi that you were seeing, for example?
So what's really interesting is when you look at a lichen, you are looking at both the fungal component and also the photosynthetic component. And studies have shown that when you try to grow the fungi without the photosynthetic counterpart, it just turns into this amorphous, unstructured mass. So the algae is actually really, really important in the structure of the lichen, which you see.
That is mind-blowing, actually. So I presume, again, this is going a little bit off topic, but if you wanted to have a collection of lichen, the chances of you being able to propagate or to cultivate them, I would say, are fairly slim, are they, because of the way they exist?
Yeah. So in general, lichens are very poor at colonizing and they're very slow at growing. So in terms of propagating them, it can be quite difficult. And in terms of reproduction, lichens have various adaptations which allow them to reproduce and disperse. We see that in an asexual and asexual form. So with asexual, what we tend to get is these little propagules that the lichens produce, which we refer to as either sporidia, which is just a massive powder, or we have the isidia, which is like these little finger-like projections. And with these propagules, what you have is both the algae and the fungal counterpart within the sporidia and the isidia. So what happens is these little propagules get blown off by wind or transported in water or on the underside of a bird's foot, and then they can disperse and colonize a new area. So that's how they asexually reproduce. So it's essentially sort of a clone of the parent lichen. But another way that they reproduce is through sexual reproduction, and that's when you get the production of fruiting bodies. So just like fungal fruits, like you'd see in non-lichenized fungi, this is where these spores are housed. So lichens, like I said earlier, they're not plants, so they don't produce seeds. They produce spores like other fungi. And then these spores will be released from the fruiting structure They will then blow off into the wind, find a suitable substrate or a suitable surface to land on, and then they will begin to germinate. And when they germinate, they will incorporate the algal partner into the structure, and that's when you get the lichen form. So with asexual reproduction, it's a much more effective strategy to disperse and to colonize new areas. But in terms of genetic diversity, it's probably not the best approach to take. And that's when you get increased genetic diversity through the sexual reproduction of lichens.
So thinking about again, going a little step back to what they look like, I have been wandering around, I suppose like a lot of people have during the colder months, and looking at branches, and I have joined my Facebook lichen group, and I kind of post pictures, and sometimes people go, that's a fungi. And there's pictures where I've taken, and there is lichen in the picture, but there's also moss, and some of those are quite similar. Is it just to the untrained eye that all of these things look relatively similar? Are they actually quite distinct when you get to know what you're looking at?
I think when you get up close and personal to lichens and you get familiar with them as a group, they are really distinct in their appearance. So when you look at a lichen, I mean, they come in all different shapes and different structures. You have the crusty crustose lichens, which tend to form mosaics, on smooth bark and on rock faces. But then you can also get these really leafy foliose lichens and the shrubby fruticose lichens, which have quite a three-dimensional structure to them. Lichens alone have a huge diversity in their aesthetics and in their appearance. But some people do tend to confuse lichens with mosses and with liverworts and with non-lichenized fungi. And the common confusion is with the bryophytes. So to distinguish them, I guess the easiest thing to do is, so with bryophytes, your mosses and liverworts, they are plants, they're non-vascular plants. And generally speaking, you tend to have a central stem with distinct leaves. And you can tend to see the actual cells of the leaf where you don't have those individual cells within a lichen. And for those liverworts that don't have that central stem, the thallose liverworts, which are very strap-like, when you look at them with a ×10 magnification lens, you really can see those distinct cells within the leaves. And you just don't get that when you look at a lichen. I would sort of take that as a general rule when you're out and about and looking at these different life forms, that I think it is just getting up close and personal to them. And going back to what I said earlier, lichens are a fungus that partner up with either an algae or a cyanobacteria. And when you pull a lichen apart and look down your magnification lens, you can actually see the white fungal filaments and also layers of algae. So that's another good way to tell them apart.
And would they have originated on, say, wood or on land, or what is their provenance? Are they ancient life forms? Did they start off in water? How did they evolve?
Very, very good question, and actually quite a difficult question to answer. So lichens were always believed to be one of the oldest life forms on the planet, and this is because lichens are a self-sustained unit. They don't necessarily have a dependency on other organisms, and lichens are always referred to as the early colonizers in ecological succession, and that's why they were thought to be the oldest and more primitive life forms on the planet. But putting an exact date on when lichens first appeared on the scene is actually really difficult, because lichens are really uncommon in the fossil record. And there were some interesting studies, and until 2017, there was something like only 15 lichen fossils that had been discovered and scientifically published. And that just simply is not enough evidence to pinpoint where fungi diverged down that lichenized route. Since 2017, so over the last 5 years, there's been a real targeted effort to try and find more lichen fossils. And there was quite a productive search where they found about 150 fossils in Baltic amber, which is like tree sap. And this has significantly increased the documented fossils. But again, like I said a second ago, as an evidence base, it's just so limited and not reflective of lichen timescales. So over the last few years, I think this is within the last 3 years actually, there's been some really fascinating research which has looked at the DNA of, I think it was over 3,000 species of lichen. And this is suggestive that the evolution of lichens actually dates back to around 200 to 250 million years ago. So you probably know more than this than me, but to try and put that into context, I think the earliest vascular plants were about 350 to 400 million years ago. So lichens are nowhere near as old as what we originally thought. And over time, as more information and more evidence becomes available and comes to light, I think these figures are likely to change. But for now, this is where we sort of stand with it all.
And are they found all over the world?
All over the world. From the highest mountains to the coastline, lichens are found absolutely everywhere. And what you find across lichens as a group is that they have a suite of adaptations which allows them to inhabit certain types of habitat. And it's just fascinating, really. They really have exploited every possible habitat that we have here on the planet.
And how many species do we have just in the UK?
Just in the UK, so that number is changing all of the time, as you can imagine, with new discoveries and taxonomic revisions. But we have over 2,000 species of lichens here within the British Isles. And again, so just to put that into context, in the last lichen flora that we had, which was published in 2009, there was just over 1,800 species of lichen. So within the last 10-ish years, a couple of hundred have been added to that list. So yeah, the number is continually increasing within the British Isles and is continually increasing across the globe. And if you're looking at a more international context, there are so many unexplored places, like the tropics. I have a colleague that does a lot of work in the tropics, and she's just sat on hundreds, if not thousands, of undescribed species that are new to science. So our knowledge is continually improving and continually getting updated as taxonomic interventions evolve, and also as new discoveries are being made.
You said about, obviously, they survive in loads of different types of environments. Thinking again about the UK, are there particular times of the year that we might see them? Are they always there, or is it just that we notice them more when, say, leaves have died back?
So lichens are always there, which makes them an excellent group of organisms to study. They're not seasonal like vascular plants and like fungi. They are there all year round, and you definitely can see them a lot better in the autumn and in the winter time when the vegetation and the foliage is off the leaves and everything's died back over the winter months. And it is probably the best time to see them as well because of the weather. They're so saturated and luxuriant. And when you look at them in the summer, they tend to be slightly more dry and crispy. So I do always think, your botanists and your entomologists who are really busy with survey work over the limited period that is like spring and summer, lichens are there all year round. So if people need to keep their interests going over the autumn and winter months, then lichens are an excellent group to get your eye in for.
And would you have to go far from maybe a standard back garden or a typical town environment? Would you have to go far and explore deep to find unusual species? How easy are they to come across?
You do not have to go far and wide to look for a lichen. I'm sat on my dining room table at the moment and I'm looking at the lichens on the window ledge. I'm looking at the lichens on the pavement. We have lichens all around us and right on our doorstep, which again makes them an excellent subject to study. And yeah, new species are getting discovered all the time. You could probably discover something relatively scarce or rare within your back garden, but it's just taking the time to get to know these life forms and to study them because they can be quite a complex group to get your eye in for, but they are just so rewarding and they're so beautiful and fascinating, and they just tell you so much about the environment in which you're looking at. Lichens have a really important story to tell, and I guess the job of a lichenologist is to try and understand that story and read the messages that lichens are telling you about the history of the environment and the quality of the environment in which they're found.
Yeah, a lot of people will say, oh, I've got lichen on my tree, so therefore my air quality is good. Is that always the case?
Yeah, that is a really generalised approach to air quality, but it is probably slightly more accurate to say that with air quality and lichens, the presence and absence of certain species tells you more about the air quality than just the fact that you've got lots of lichens on the tree, so therefore you must have good air quality. So some lichens are really, really sensitive to air pollution, so you will only get those in very clean air situations. So that's one distinct community. But then you'll have a different community that is very tolerant of pollution, tolerant of sulfur dioxide pollution, tolerant of nitrogen pollution. And it's the presence and absence of different species that allow you to make inferences about the quality of the environment that you're studying. So it's not quite as simple as saying, oh, there's lots of lichens on this tree, therefore the air quality must be really good, because you might have lots of lichens on the tree, and all of those species are what we refer to as nitrophiles, so nitrogen-loving species. And it's not that they're loving of high nitrogen pollution, but they're just very tolerant of those conditions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So also thinking about that air quality, what is life like for lichens at the moment, given things like we have a lot of development in terms of buildings, we have air pollution, we have climate change, is life becoming more difficult for them, or will, as you say, will they just continue to adapt to changing conditions?
You have winners and losers in the natural world to every situation that you face. And I think with lichens, where they are so incredibly sensitive to their surrounding environment and where they're very poor at colonising and slow at growing, they can very quickly be removed from a habitat in which they were originally recorded. And as you said, there's increased pressures on the natural world, from development to climate change to pollution incidents. And lichens aren't quick at responding to that. And we are seeing changes in distribution and abundances and compositions all across the UK, which is sort of strongly correlated to these human-induced and anthropogenic pressures.
Are there species that are specific to a particular material, for example? I mean, I've just come back from holiday where there was an old manor house. It was Purbeck stone. The outside was colonised with these amazing yellow and grey lichen. Would they be specific to that stone even? Or are they that fussy? Or can they be found on maybe a variety of hosts?
So lichens are very choosy and very fussy as to where they live. So if you were to go to the limestone rocks of Cheddar Gorge, you would have a totally different suite of lichens to the acid granite that you get on Dartmoor, for example. So in that case, the rock texture, the rock chemistry is a really important factor which influences what lichens grow on the substrate. And that's also the same with trees, so the acid bark of a birch tree will support very different lichens to the less acidic, more base-rich bark of an ash tree. So when you're in any situation, diversity of habitats and microhabitats is really important when you're looking at lichen diversity. So if I was to go out and do a survey of a woodland, for example, tree species diversity is something that we always promote and recommend, because if you increase the tree species diversity, naturally you're going to increase the lichen diversity that is present within that habitat. And it's sort of going back to our rocks. If you go to a churchyard, for example, you have a really rich variety of different rock types. And each of those different rock types will have different chemistries, different textures, different water holding capacities. And again, that all influences the lichens that grow in that habitat.
And are there some generalists that you might find in a lot of different places?
Absolutely. So you always have your generalists. So you'll have, we call them cosmopolitan, and they can sort of inhabit any type of habitat, and you tend to get your usual suspects popping up in all sorts of different situations.
And do they have common names? Again, I've been trying desperately to learn my ID, but I'm failing miserably so far. But I did wonder, do these lichens have common names? I know that comes with kind of recognition and becoming part of the community parlance, I suppose. And I don't know if that is the case for lichen, but yeah, I just thought I'd ask the question.
So lichens do have common names, but they are terrible. So I think when learning lichens, it really is best if you can try and stick with the Latin. On the British Lichen Society website, there is a table which you can download, and it's made a start of compiling all of the different common names of lichens. But what I actually find with the common names is sometimes they're more difficult to remember than the Latin itself. And when you start delving into the Latin and the build-up of the name behind the lichen, it's just such a beautiful thing to study, because the Latin and the Greek is actually really descriptive of the lichen which you're looking at. And I think when you start to break down and look at the syntax of the specific and the genus name, it tells you so much about the lichen. And yeah, I would just really encourage people to stick with the Latin if they can. What you'll find as well, and I'm sure it's the case with plants, is that you might have a common name which is assigned to 10 different species of lichen, dependent on where you are in the world. So at least with the Latin, you always know exactly what you're talking about, and it's that common point of reference which everyone recognises internationally.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I agree. So my final question is, obviously they're made up of the fungi and algae or cyanobacteria. So these things quite often are associated with having a medicinal or an edible use. Is that the case with any of the lichens?
So there is a really long cultural history of lichens as a food source. And I think it's the case that only certain lichens are edible and only some have been proven to have some form of nutritional value. And I just want to cover my back and the British Lichen Society's back, in that I'm not advocating for people to eat lichens, and I'd probably discourage it actually, because I'm not entirely sure which lichens are safe to eat. And it is important to stress that some lichens are poisonous, and there are lichens in the UK which are poisonous. A few examples of lichens as food sources, and I think the most renowned example is the rock tripe. And the rock tripe or rock tripes are species that belong to the family Umbilicariaceae. And within the UK, our best example of that is one which we call Lasalia pustulata. And this is a type of rock tripe. And this species is characteristic of acid upland environments. And it's been documented that this species was boiled and eaten by mountaineers in times of food shortage when they were up on the fells. And this family more widely is regularly eaten in Asian food culture. So we have our rock tripes. Another example of lichens as food or as drink is one which we call Citraria icelandica, or it's called the Icelandic lichen, I think is the common name. And this was boiled up and it's drunk as Icelandic tea. So that's another nice example. And if you go to any Asian food market, you can normally pick up packets of lichen, and they tend to be used as flavour enhancers and also to add spice to food. So, yeah, there is a long history of lichen cuisine, I guess, from various different parts of the globe. But touching upon what you said about the medicinal purposes, so lichens tend to be famous for the doctrine of signatures. And this was a concept where plants and fungi, if they resemble parts of the body, it was suggested by herbalists that they could be used to treat minor ailments. And a good example, so, is called the lungwort lichen, or Laberia pulmonaria. And this is one of the large foliose lichens that you get in old woodland situations. And it has these really big ridged lobes, and it was thought that these resemble lung tissue, which you can kind of see in the field. And this was boiled up and ingested, and it was used to treat respiratory problems. So there's no necessary scientific evidence to suggest that anything with the doctrine of signatures worked. And there is that common question is, do lichens have these medicinal properties, or is it simply an unproven concept? Lichens, I guess, do have these biomedical properties. And the biomedical aspect is quite an interesting aspect of lichenology. And this is because the fungal component of the lichen association produces these chemicals, which we call secondary metabolites. So these are the chemicals produced that are not directly involved in the lichen's metabolism, but are used for secondary purposes and serve other functions for survival, such as anti-UV or sunscreen, and also for the purpose of anti-herbivory. And it's these secondary metabolites that have these biomedical properties, so things like antifungal, antibacterial, antimicrobial. And some chemicals that lichens produce have actually been shown to inhibit the growth of cancer cells in laboratory conditions. So the pharmaceutical potential of lichens is absolutely huge, but the problem is that the chemists struggle to synthesize the chemicals at a large enough scale to actually apply to human testing. So I'm sure at some point in the future, this is going to change as technology advances, but it's just an aspect that needs loads of money investing into it and needs developing. So yes to lichens being eaten as food, yes to the medicinal properties, and we're going to see some really interesting advances over the years to come with both of these.
It's such a vast topic, and I'm sure people will want to find out more about it. What are some resources and where are the best places people can go to find out more?
So the best place to go when wanting to develop your study with lichens or connect with like-minded people who are also interested in lichens is probably the British Lichen Society website. So the British Lichen Society, or BLS for short, as a collective, we aim to promote the study, enjoyment and conservation of lichens across the British Isles. And on our website, there's various opportunities to get involved, sort of ignite your interest or to develop your interest. And what's brilliant is that everyone who's involved with the society is just so dedicated and committed to the lichen cause. And there's lots of fantastic ways to get involved. And I would encourage everyone to have a little look at the BLS website.
Well, if you haven't already developed a liking for lichen, as I most definitely have in recent months, I suggest you get out and start noticing these underappreciated yet fascinating and absorbing life forms. And if you want to know more, go check out the British Lichen Society, join your local lichen group, get on Facebook, buy yourself some identification charts and get lichen spotting. A very big thank you to April for being a great ambassador for lichen and to you for listening and taking an interest. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next with an update on a butterfly that you should start seeing in the next few weeks if you haven't already.
Yellow is the brightest colour of our visible spectrum. A tranquil, welcoming colour that in many cultures symbolises happiness and warmth. And when spring arrives, it seems like the harsh daylight of winter becomes mellowed by soft, calming tints of yellow from strengthening sunlight and the many springtime flowers that reflect yellow from their petals. Spring is also the time when Britain's only resident yellow butterfly, the Brimstone, is back on the wing, after hibernating for around 8 months, usually amongst an ivy or bramble. And there'll be frequent visitors to gardens throughout England and Wales as they search for nectar to replenish the energy they'll have lost during their long hibernation. However, it's the male brimstones that'll be most easily recognised, with their rich, yellow, butter-coloured wings, who it's widely assumed are the reason why butterflies are called butterflies. The females, however, are a less vibrant pastel green colour, but still have the same unmistakable leaf-shaped wings as the males, which, unlike most other butterflies, will never be seen in the open position when the butterfly is at rest. But on warm sunny days, it'll be common for us to see male and female brimstones engaged in lengthy courtship flights around and above our gardens, that end with them seemingly vanishing amongst the plants to mate, perfectly camouflaged amongst the leaves. The females will then depart to find buckthorn bushes, where they'll begin laying small white bottle-shaped eggs, individually, onto freshly opened leaves. The little green caterpillars that emerge from the eggs feed on the leaves for about a month, before securing themselves to the plant by a tiny silk girdle, and then changing into a chrysalis. Then just 2 or 3 weeks later, the next generation of brimstone butterflies will begin to hatch. However, these pristine new butterflies won't be interested in finding a mate though, but instead just nectar-rich summer flowers, where they'll feed day after day until the onset of autumn, when they'll slip into tangled cover from an ivy or bramble plant to hibernate until the following spring. And so, by knowing the relatively simple life cycle of the brimstone butterfly, it'll be quite easy for many of us to help them within our gardens, simply by ensuring that throughout the year there are nectar-rich flowering plants, an ivy-covered fence or tree trunk, and a buckthorn bush or two somewhere amongst the plantings.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.